Woo! Hello, Facebook. How are y'all? Welcome to the another installment of the Wednesday Writing Workshop. I am Sarah Webb, so I'm going live on Instagram now. Yay! Hey, Instagram. So as people are joining, please say hello. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Hey, Jendelle. Let me know how the weather is where you are. Let me know how your day is going. And especially if this is your first time. Hey, Mixed Millennial. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining. Hey, Sienna. Good to see y'all. So we're just doing introductions, hellos, and welcomes. Today's topic is racism versus colorism. Yes, I think it's a little noisy where I am, so I'm trying to make sure I keep the background noise down. Oh, we got a lot of people joining. Hey, Hebrew Israelites of all mixes. Sophie, Co's Art. Hey, the Black Self-Love Sage. Hey, y'all. So again, today's topic is going to be racism versus colorism. And I'm just taking a minute to say hello with all of you, to check in, see how y'all are feeling, see what the weather's like where you are. And before we get started, I also want to make some announcements. So that goes for you all on Facebook as well. We got a hello from Jandy. So the big announcement, of course, is that we are a little over a week away from the book launch. That's right. So those of you who don't know, I host an international writing contest every year. And the people who participate in that have the opportunity to be published in an anthology. And so I have about 16 of those writers, diverse writers, joining me live to talk about colorism, to read some of their writings about colorism. And we will have a live Q&A. So make sure you have your questions ready. Make sure you have your comments ready. And we'll also be doing a trivia game so you can win prizes. Now, here, this is important, right? So in order to be prepared for the trivia questions, you want to RSVP on the Colorism Healing Facebook page, okay? So all the information that we'll be asking questions about for trivia will be on the Facebook page for Colorism Healing, the event page. So if you are not following me on Facebook, you can still find the event page and click that you're going so that you get updates and notifications, right? So there's information about like who designed the covers for the books. There's information about when the contest first started, right? So that kind of background information related to the contest. So Jendelle says, whoop, whoop. Hey, Elizabeth, how are you? Let me make sure I haven't missed any comments. Okay, Sienna says, hi. And then the other announcement is the same one I make every week, which is that I am here every Wednesday at 4 p.m. talking on various issues related to colorism. And again, if you're just joining, my topic for this week is a very common question that people have, which is what is the difference between racism and colorism, right? So one of my first questions as we get started is how many people tuning in now feel like they are pretty clear about the difference between racism and colorism, right? So if you feel like you could explain that to your uncle or your niece, this is racism versus X being colorism, type a yes in the chat. If you're completely clueless about the difference, then type no, say no, I'm not clear. This is why I'm here, to learn what the difference is. And then if you're kind of sort of in between, like maybe you know some examples of both, but you're not completely clear about how they're related and how they're different, then say that too. You can either put a question mark or say so. Women Unplugged, you sent me a DM, I will definitely check that. Also Juneteenth day after tomorrow, yes, so June 19th. It's very exciting. It's a lot of places I've been going to said they were closing early to celebrate Juneteenth, or that they're paying their employees, additional time for working on that day. So they're recognizing it as a holiday, which they should have been doing a long time ago, but we'll take it. right? Sienna says, yes, very clear, absolutely. The Black Self-Love Sage, I believe that colorism is a subcategory of racism. Okay. Hey, BJ Betty. Cole's Art, the one and only, says, pretty clear, but want to hear you speak on it. Absolutely. And then Women Unplugged says, thank you. And Jendelle on Facebook says, yes, 100% clear. Okay. Hebrew Israelites of all mixes says, one communal and the other is outside predatory force. Okay, good. So I think the crowd here, all of us who've gathered to watch today, are mostly familiar with racism versus colorism, right? Armando, hey Armando, says yes, but we need more digestible conversations. Absolutely. So I'll jump in with a few major points. And for those of you who have not done a live workshop with me before, I do like to ask questions like this, but you can also ask me questions throughout the live stream, right? And I'm happy to answer those as well. So the first thing we know about race, those of you who are on here, I'm sure you know this, is that race is a system of categories and labels that humans came up with, right? Really a select few humans, right? I didn't have any say in these labels or these categories. Most of you probably were not at the drawing table when this system of categories came to be, right? But we do know that they are human categories, human classifications, right? Humans observed differences in physical appearance, differences in cultural practices, right? And they said, oh, well, we're going to call ourselves X group, and we're going to call these people over there B group, right? We're going to say you're white, or you're black, or you're brown, or you're Asian, right? But we also know that your skin color is something that you're born with, and it's independent of any particular label, right? And so unlike my racial category of black or my ethnicity African American, my melanin is a biological fact. So I always say race is a social construct, but color, skin tone, is a biological fact, right? That's a reality that regardless of the label, regardless of if we ever do away with quote unquote racism or racial categories, I will still be a darker brown than a lot of other people, right? Let's see some comments. So that's one of the first nuggets, right? In terms of helping people to understand the difference between racism and colorism, is that my skin tone is the biological fact that's dependent on how much melanin my body produces, versus the labels and the categories and the classifications that we as humans sort of all agree on or abide by or follow more or less, not necessarily follow perfectly or exactly the same way. There are a lot of comments coming through on Instagram. Let's see. Do you think God made a mistake making the different races? No, I do not think God made a mistake making the different races. I think the diversity is beautiful. I think our attitudes about the diversity is the problem, not the diversity itself. So I always say, I see color and I love it, right? So I'm not upset that there are different kinds of trees. I'm not upset that there are different kinds of flowers, right? I'm not upset that there are different kinds of people. Because my attitude is that the difference is not inherently bad. I love the variety in human beings, just like I love the variety in nature, right? And I know that nature is not sustainable without levels of diversity, without levels of variety, right? Sophie says, I feel like colorism is racism's child. I feel like I am clear, but I think my Facebook feed stopped. Okay. I feel like colorism is racism's child. I feel like I am clear, but since I am super fair skinned, I believe tons of blind spots that I have towards the topic. Absolutely. I can see how there would be a lot of blind spots. Just like people who don't necessarily have to deal with an issue as much, just like me being able-bodied, right? I have a lot of blind spots when it comes to accessibility issues, right? Getting in and out of buildings and that sort of thing. Elizabeth Upshur says, yes. The Grandasa model says, please archive this for later listening. Absolutely, I always do that. I save them to my IGTV stories now, right? Which is a new feature that's readily available. So I'm glad they made that possible. Hebrew Israelites of all mixes says, blood bends, but cultures clash. That's an interesting phrase. The Black Self-Love Sage. Self-love sage. I like that. It flows off the tongue really nicely. It says exactly 4 Ys. Okay. So that was my first little nugget on really helping people get clear about the distinction, is that my color is my biological fact, how much melanin my body produces, and that's just always natural. And then the racial categories, race is a system of words and labels and classifications that a set of humans agreed upon at one point in history, and that generations afterwards have, pretty much gone along with. The next big thing that I think is important for keeping the distinctions between colorism and racism is to avoid using color as a synonym for race. So I think a lot of the confusion that I see and that exists between the two issues is that so often people just say color as a euphemism for racism, right? Meaning racism is kind of a touchy subject, or race is a touchy subject, so they say color instead of race, right? They use them as synonyms. And I think that has been a barrier in people's understanding of colorism as an issue specifically, at least in my experience. And I don't know if other people have had similar experiences where you're talking to someone about colorism and they're sort of seem to be using it as race, right? But we think about the famous MLK speech, the I Have a Dream speech, where he says, I wish that I dream that my children would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And I remember growing up, also sort of accepting that as synonymous with race, right? Even myself, even when I talk about colorism now, I didn't always, really understand the concept myself. So I would hear things like that. I would hear people say things like, I don't see color, right, as a way to say that they're not racist. So I think our culture uses color and race as synonyms a lot, which I think can be a barrier to understanding the differences. Sophie says, thank you for doing this. It is my joy, as always. Jindal says, still here. Good. Okay. And then the key, though, about using color and race synonymously, right, is that you can be the same color, but be different races. And then next, you can be, I'm missing comments on Facebook, sorry. You can be the same race, but have different colors, right? Cuz Art says, early on, I wasn't clear on that. Learned a lot in the last few years. Good. I think there is more dialogue and more conversations that have been happening recently. Vincent, hey, Vincent says, hey, Guh, on Facebook, tuning in. Janelle says, color is an actual thing. People can be different colors, but the same race. Absolutely, Jandel on Facebook. So you can be the same race, you can have the same label as Black or African American, but have very different skin tones, hair textures, noses, eye colors, lips, size and shape of your lips can all be very different, right? You can look completely different and still be the same category, our racial category, right? And vice versa, you can have very European features, but not be considered white, right? There's one point I want to mention, right, which is that part of the racism that is evident in these categories and these classifications is that no one who looks like me would ever be classified as white, right? No one with my dark skin complexion, no one with my kinky hair texture or my nose shape would ever be classified as white, right? But we know a lot of people who are classified as Black who have European features, right? They have long straight hair, they have a very thin nose, thin facial features, they might even have blue or green eyes and very, white or pale skin, but yet they're still classified as Black, right? So this is getting into a little bit of the history. I'm going to pause because I have some comments coming in. Hey, Andre, how are you? The Black Self-Love Sage, can we talk about ethnicity versus race? Yes, I'll throw that in as well. Ethnicity versus race, because we do use those as synonyms a lot too, and they aren't the same. The Hebrew Israelites of all mixes says tension will always remain amongst the races because, like it or not, we're a collective population and no one in their right mind will be preservationist for another race group outside of their own. Absolutely, no one outside of their mind. And yet colorism exists, right? Which is part of the, I guess, pathology of it, right? Is that And I've had comments like this on TikTok where they say, well, it's natural to prefer to be around people who look like your parents, right? And so I always question that then. So why do, Black people say they want their children to look white, right? Or why do Black people say, I only date light-skinned people or non-Black women, right? So if that is very much what the research of the history says, that, oh, we tend to gravitate towards people who look like us, right? So then I think that exposes the colorism amongst African Americans and Black people and people of color even more, right? Is that we are breaking that sort of evolutionary tendency, right? To be around people who look like us. We actually don't do that. A lot of times we are trying to get away from people who look like us, right? Which is why we know colorism is such an issue. Jindal says right. And Cuz Art, the one and only, says physical traits can also contribute to the colorism as well. Glad you brought that up. Yes. Hi, Bayo. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I can't stay, but I love what you do and can't wait for your book launch. Thank you. I'm so excited that you were able to tune in even for just a little bit, and that you're planning to attend the live book launch as well. So again, the fact that you can be classified as Black, even though you look white, goes back to the historical rule in the United States, anyway, of the one drop rule. Thumbs up if you've heard of the one drop rule. Yes? How many people have heard of that? Also known as the rule of hypodescent, right? And so this was not a historical practice in every country, but it is one that is widely known, and it's still practiced today. If not legally, it is at least socially accepted, right? So Sophie says yes. Dimples Music Shoes says yes. They've all heard of that, right? And so for those of you who are not as familiar, oh, we're getting some good thumbs up. Yes, my multicolored thumbs up. The one drop rule says that if you just have a little bit of Black ancestry, a little bit of African ancestry, that you're classified as Black, right? It was 1/16, right? And so you quantify that through the generations, and you can still be legally classified as Black. So that signifies or suggests a couple of things, right? It suggests that in order to be white, you have to be pure, right? So going back to my comment that there are people who look white, but they get to be classified as Black, but very rarely will you see someone who looks Black, AKA looks like me, who is allowed to be classified as white, right? And that's because the people who made that law, the people who made that rule, were white supremacists. And so in their theory, white was pure, right? Black represented impurity, right? And so the rule of hypodescent, the one drop rule, was basically saying that whiteness was the pure standard, and anything else that was added to that was tainting it. And so it can no longer be classified as white, right? So the one drop rule, the rule of hypodescent, was created by white supremacists. And so it was white supremacists in its origins. And so I'll come back to that comment because I don't want to lose my train of thought. So it also is capitalist, right? So this was not done by mistake in the United States during slavery. This rule was instituted during slavery specifically because you could only legally enslave people who were classified as Black, right? And so since you can pick a classification, right? It's not like skin color where it's a biological fact. It's a socially agreed upon designation. Then if I designate more people as Black, then that means I have more people to exploit and enslave for free labor, right? So again, the people who were making these laws, people who were making these rules, were doing so to fatten their own pockets, to perpetuate their own power, and to perpetuate their own privilege in society, right? So I know that is a lot of years of history condensed into just a few seconds. I'm going to pause, read some comments. So we got a lot of thumbs up, right? Of all you people who've heard the one drop rule. It's been widely practiced and widely accepted by people of all races, especially in the United States and the Western Hemisphere. Hebrew Israelites on Instagram says, even in the Bible, after God used Moses freed the Israelites out of Egypt in Exodus, he called the Israelites a kingdom of priests, a holy nation above all people on earth. And I've heard they're Bantu. That's an important piece of history. I'm not as familiar with that though. So maybe if you do a live on that, Hebrew Israelites of all mixes, we can have a deeper discussion and you could help to educate us further on that particular history. Even Wade in the Water says we're the ones Moses led. And then on Facebook and Facebook, we just have more comments about the relevancy of this topic. So a lot of African Americans and Black people in the United States, we have accepted the one drop rule. And I think throughout history, right, we had no choice at one point but to accept it because it was the law. It was practiced legally, right? And even socially, we were put into situations and circumstances, right, that reinforced the one drop rule, the rule of hypo descent, right? But I think also a lot of Black people see it as a positive, right? That, okay, we are going to embrace this diversity among us as Black people in the United States. We're going to embrace the fact that we have a shared experience despite what we look like, right? We actually like the fact that Blackness can be so many different things, that Blackness is not monolithic, right? That Blackness can persist throughout generations, right? Even if we marry non-Black people, right? So the idea that you can have a non-Black parent and still be considered Black. A lot of Black people see pride in that, right? Like, yes, our Blackness, lasts and persists and perseveres throughout generations, even when people try to suppress it. But I also think it's important to acknowledge like where that comes from so that we aren't blindly accepting it, right? And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't accept the one drop rule, but I think it's important for us as Black people in the United States specifically to understand the origin of it and to understand why we accept it, right? So if we accept the one drop rule, I think it's important for us to understand why and be intentional about the fact that we're on board with that practice and with that philosophy. And I think the one drop rule is perfectly an example of how race is a social construct, right? It's something that people decided. And racism crumbles under the weight of its own logic, right? Because it's really not a logical system. And I think that's why colorism is so important to talk about. So that's my next topic about racism versus colorism, is thinking about the ramifications of each and sort of looking at the parallels between the two, right? So one reason why colorism is so important to talk about, in addition to racism, is that no matter what we do with the actual labels, with the specific categories, with being Black versus being African American versus being Asian or Chinese or Hispanic or Latinx, right? Regardless of what we are naming ourselves and calling ourselves, our appearance, our phenotypes, right, our hair textures and our skin tones are going to persist. Even if we do away with labels. People say, well, I don't like the labels. They say, well, what are you? And I say, well, I'm just a human. I don't like labels. That's fine. We can do away with racial categories. We can do away with labels, but you're still going to see me the way you see me based on my skin tone and my hair texture, right? So there's a lot of implicit bias at play with colorism that has to be acknowledged. I'm getting a lot of comments, so I do want to read them. The Black Self-Love Sage says, the brown paper bag test is an example of how we've perpetuated the one drop rule in our own communities. Absolutely. Sienna says, as I've been reading, featureism goes hand in hand with colorism. Yes. So I've always used colorism to include features and hair texture as well, but people have parsed out color versus features versus hair. So they also talk about texturism and that kind of thing. But I see colorism as the totality of wanting to look more European and not wanting to look as Black or African, right? Even though we know African is very diverse and the United States could fit in the continent of Africa 3 times over. So there's mass diversity even on that continent. Jandel says, you can still be categorized by your color and features without having a racial label. Absolutely. And I think I see this a lot in Brazil, right? In Brazilian cultures. They all consider themselves to be one race. They see themselves as just being Brazilian, right? But they have names for people based on their phenotype, based on their hair texture, their color, their features, their body types, right? Their eye color, right? So even though they all identify racially or ethnically as Brazilian, they very much segment and label and categorize people based on their physical appearance. Hebrew Israelite says, in my hood, colorism was a safety thing. Those of oppressor blood were less trusted because they're snitch out uprising plots to the other side of their close relation to the other side. I have heard about that, like during the civil rights movement. Mixed race people or biracial people or lighter skinned African Americans were seen as suspects because they had a lot of access, right, to white people or to white communities. They were more accepted in white communities. They were more trusted by white communities, right? And so there was, because there was a closer relationship they had with white people, then that was seen as suspects, right? I want to go back to the idea about racism versus colorism in terms of the impact, right? So a lot of people talk about currently what's going on with police brutality and thinking about racism a lot. And I did make an Instagram post where I mentioned that there are similar parallels to the disparities and the inequalities between white people and black people and brown people as there are amongst those groups of black and brown people, right? So we know we get really, really mad when we say that white people on average, have higher incomes, right? Or earn more money, are more likely to get hired by an employee, are less likely to spend time in jail, right? Well, those same kinds of statistics, that same kind of research shows that between light-skinned African Americans and Latinx people and dark-skinned African Americans and Latinx people, the same inequalities exist, the same disparities exist, right? And that's not comfortable for people of color to hear, right? Because we're so used to being angry at the black-white divide or the white-brown divide that it's hard for us to acknowledge, much less accept that divide exists amongst African Americans and it exists amongst Latino and Hispanic people as well. So we know that lighter skinned African Americans are more on par with white people when it comes to things like income, when it comes to things like employment and how they're treated in the justice system, how they're treated in schools, how much education they attain, how likely they are to get married by a certain age, especially among women, right? And that's why I think in talking about racism versus colorism, I personally do not pit racism as the bigger or the more urgent issue, right? Because when you look at the actual data, when you look at the actual research, a lot of times what we consider a black-white issue is really a dark-skinned black person versus a white issue, right? If you look at the graphs, if you look at the charts, and I know what I'm saying might be hard for some people to hear, but if you look at the charts that show white people doing better in healthcare outcomes and black people doing not as well in healthcare outcomes, you're going to see similar, almost the same graphs when it comes to light-skinned black people and dark-skinned black people, right? And so racism versus colorism to me is not what people typically say or think of, which is that, well, racism is the real issue, right? And that colorism is just a subset of that. And I think a lot of this is explained because of implicit bias, right? And so I've heard like some posts say, well, the cops are not going to stop and ask me if I'm light-skinned or if I'm biracial when they stop me. And my response to that is that they don't have to ask you if you're light-skinned because they can see it, right? And so that's what implicit bias is. Implicit bias is more relevant in situations like racial profiling because it is based on what you see. It's based on that instantaneous stereotype. It's based on that instantaneous trigger, that instantaneous fear, that instantaneous suspicion, right? And so you're not always clear on what someone's race is. People can be racially ambiguous. People can be black but look white. So you can't always determine that they're a black person or a white person just by looking at them. But you always see if they're dark skinned. You always see if they have kinky hair. You always see if they have a wide nose, right? Even if you don't know what my ethnicity is or what my race is, right? So I think that's a conversation that a lot of people aren't aware of, is that the disparities caused by colorism parallel and oftentimes mimic the disparities that we attribute to racism. I'm going to let that sit for a second and read some of these comments. Jandel on Facebook says, we should be up in arms about the light-dark divide too. And I agree with that. I think if we're upset that white people have better outcomes in education, we should also be upset that light-skinned people have better outcomes in education, right? To me, but I am dark-skinned, so maybe that's what that comes from. Sophie says, I feel like a lot of lighter skinned people are defensive against these facts because it feeds into an internal identity conflict many cannot even verbalize, and that is fragility. Yeah, I do see a lot of defensiveness, and I think it is difficult and painful sometimes to recognize privilege, especially light skin privilege, because there is racism still at play, right? And so I think it's important and helpful to know, for light-skinned people to know, that you can acknowledge privilege due to colorism without negating the oppression you still experience because of racism. I think those two things can exist at the same time, right? You can still be oppressed and hated by other people because you are Black or African American, at the same time that those people might treat you a little better than someone who's darker skinned, right? They might not accept you into their family, but they might not also shut the door in your face completely. And I think it's okay for us to acknowledge the nuance and the complexity, right? And that things are not, quote unquote, black and white. I do want to, while I'm answering questions, I want to answer the question about race versus ethnicity. I forgot who asked that question. Let's see, but I'll answer it anyway. So hopefully you're still watching. So a lot of times we use race and ethnicity as synonyms as well, but ethnicity has more to do with the combination of your race and your nationality. That's one easy way to think about it. So you can be an American and be Black, and so your ethnicity would be African American, right? But you can be Black and be Kenyan. You can be Black and be British. You can be Black and be Brazilian, right? So Black is sort of what we consider as the racial category, and then the ethnicity is tied into the culture and the region and the nation that you are from, right? So how does your Blackness manifest when you're in America versus when you're living in the UK versus when you're living in Mexico, right? And the same is true for like white people who are considered racially white, but their ethnicity is Irish, or their ethnicity is German, or their ethnicity is Italian, right? And so you have all these white people with different ethnicities, but depending on where they are from in the world. And the same is true for Black people, the same is true for Hispanic and Latinx people, right? Also, if you notice, it is a census year. So on the census, it says, are you Hispanic, non-Black, right? Are you Hispanic and white? So it's possible to be Hispanic or Latinx and still be categorized as racially white or racially Black. Jandel on Facebook is saying, so well explained, you can play this as a racism versus colorism 101 webinar. All right, thank you. There's a lot to unpack, and I probably won't get to all of it because I try to keep these in 30 minutes, and I'm not even done with everything on my agenda yet. I have covered the meat of it, so if you have to leave early, because I know it's over 30 minutes at this point, I have covered the meat of what I want to talk about, and this will be available for replay on Facebook and Instagram, so you can always come back and also share it with anyone who might want a deeper dive into the differences between these two issues. The last thing I'll say is that racism has, am I missing the questions? I am. I'll say this last thing and then I'll spend the last 5 minutes answering the questions that I'm missing. So racism does use color to establish the superiority of whiteness, right? To perpetuate white supremacy, right? And so a lot of times colorism stemmed from the fact that Black people and other people of color realized that they could have better chances in society, that they can have upward mobility, upward social mobility if they looked more white, or if they looked less Black, or if they looked less indigenous, right? And so that's a lot of ways that colorism is perpetuated amongst African Americans, amongst Hispanics and Latinx people, right? Is that we look very black or very African, or we look very indigenous, right? Very native. And that is something that we were told was less than, we were told that it was inferior, right? And so we try to move up the scale, right, to get as close to the white norm, the white standard as possible, right? And so white supremacy and racism says that the color of whiteness and the features of whiteness are superior, and that the colors and the features of blackness are the most inferior, right? They're the direct opposite. And so colorism comes into play because there's a spectrum in between those two polar opposites, right? And now again, I'm talking about the social hierarchy, the social system. I'm not saying what I actually believe. So please don't take a soundbite and say, this is what Dr. Webb said. But the way the social hierarchy has been established, right, to look racially white and to have that category is seen as, you know, the upper echelon, and then to be black or dark or have, you know, kinky hair is seen as the polar opposite. So not only are you less attractive, but you're also more savage. Think about that. You're also more criminal, more suspect, you're less intelligent, right? All these other associations that come with whiteness, right? You're less normal, you're less good. Thinking about why there's a difference in the suspension rates of dark-skinned black girls and light-skinned black girls, right? It's because dark-skinned girls are seen as bad and ratchet and rugged, and, you know, they're probably ignorant and they're probably loud and ghetto anyway, and they probably deserve to get suspended. These are things I hear people say. I haven't heard people say this. And I'm only smiling and laughing because it's that ridiculous, right? Not because it's funny, because it's ridiculous. And so I think keeping that in mind is that the racism and the white supremacy and the anti-blackness throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, has motivated a lot of people of color to try to strive to look more white and to look less African or less indigenous, right? And so we too have bought into that system, right? Well, maybe I should marry a non-black person so that my child comes out lighter and has a looser curl pattern, right? And that is a practice that, even though it's taboo to say it, people still practice it and people still say it. You know, in this audience, we see it as something that's not good to say or do. But if we're honest, we all know people in our lives. We all have family members, friends, coworkers, colleagues, classmates who are proud to say these things, right? Who are proud to say, oh, I'm so glad that my children came out light. You know, I'm so glad my daughter has their mom's hair or their dad's hair, right? Because it'll be easier to comb, right? So even though this audience of people probably is not there, we've encountered far too many people who still perpetuate these beliefs in these systems. All right, now I'm going to catch up on my excellent comments and questions. A lot of things coming in on Instagram. If I miss your comment, just let me know. Say, hey, I asked the question. Can you go back and answer it? The black self-love. Okay. So I see one above that. But Hebrew Israelites say, what would you say the percentage marker be to claiming black? Many can't answer that. That's why I don't get why people get mad at white people wearing blackface at protests. Black, not a nationality. I think people get mad at white people wearing blackface because of the history of blackface itself. So it was a derogatory practice meant to mimic and stereotype black people as being ignorant, to being buffoons and, you know, quote unquote coonery, and being ignorant and criminals, stealing and just bad behavior, right? That blackface practice was always not to say, oh, I'm black, but I am making fun of black people, right? So it wasn't like they were trying to pass as black. It was they were trying to target black people as being inferior, right? So that's where the history of blackface comes from. The black self-love sage. A lot of light-skinned people have struggled to understand how to identify because they cannot be entirely accepted by either white people or dark-skinned people. I agree with that. And I think that that speaks to the problem of these systems in the first place, right? Because black is not inherent to who you are. Black is a label, it's a social construct, right? And so I always say, right, that you can choose to identify as you want to. But because it is something that we agree upon, it's also okay for it to be up for discussion and up for debate, right? I think it's okay to ask, what is blackness? I think it's okay to say, what does it mean to be white? I think like the question before, it says, what quantity constitutes as black? I think we should be critiquing and thinking critically about these things and not passively accepting them, right? And I know that with a lot of light-skinned people, that comes with a level of pain, right? Because they don't fit into or aren't easily as easily accepted by any group. But I think for humanity as a whole, it is good that we are critiquing the logic of these systems, right? Are they actually still serving us? Is it actually still serving us to continue with something that was created during slavery for the purposes of perpetuating slavery, right? Which the one-drop rule did. And I think healing, right? So that's why I call this page and this work Colorism healing, because when we've healed as individuals, we have less of a stake in controlling or policing other people's identities, right, in general. And that goes from everybody from the white descendants of the white slave masters to descendants of enslaved African people, right? Once we've healed individually, but also collectively and socially, like healed our social consciousness, then we mitigate and we heal that alienation that you're speaking of, that a lot of light-skinned people feel. Let's see, the Hebrew Israelite, I think, okay, so I'm not too far behind on my question. The colorism fight is to establish a safeguarding gate, keep it to our community, so someone can't say my mom's mom, dad, mom so black, I'm a light-skinned black. See how that sounds. Yeah, I'm not really clear on that statement. I don't know if maybe I'm misreading it. Sophie says, I do agree, but I find it hard to make people understand. Yes, it is hard to make people understand. And then making people understand maybe is not the goal, because I think people who don't want to understand, people have other barriers to understanding that are beyond logic or reason, right? So sometimes it's not that they can't logically or rationally understand it, it's that they're not in an emotional place to accept it, right? So that lack of understanding sometimes is just not being emotionally ready to accept what is clearly trying to break through for them intellectually. I feel like what Malcolm X said was right. Integration divided our community and collectiveness as a people. The Black Self-Love said, me, thank you. Thank you for hosting this discussion. There are so many layers that we have to explore to get to the root of this issue. Thank you for hosting the discussion. Yep. It's a very common casual thing. It's said commonly. My daughter heard that in 7th grade from her peers. Black doesn't come with white in it. You can't have a black child without 2 black parents. When I was younger, I thought the opposite. I wanted my children to be darker than me so that it would be easier to be accepted by the community and wouldn't have to deal with being in between. If you're biracial, you should be embraced by both ethnicities. Dimple's Music said, being. Let's stop labeling biracial people as black. They're biracial. Black doesn't come with white in it. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Only Americans call biracial people black. Yeah, that's what I was saying about the one-drop rule. It was an American practice. I'm from the UK, and we refer to them as what they are, mixed race or biracial. We fully embrace them. We don't label them and make them pick a side. Okay, good. Yeah, so there is a specific issue in the United States with the one-drop rule that I think adds a really weird dynamic to the colorism and to the racial climate in the US. So really quickly, I'll give my homework and my affirmation. My homework is to explain to someone the difference between colorism and racism. Take a shot at it. Give it a try, right? And again, just acknowledge that if they seem to not be able to understand, it might not be your ability to explain it. It might be their emotional readiness to accept it that is getting in the way. Can I say I'm mixed because my dad's dad, paternal granddad, had 2 white granddads? I think you can technically say that all people are mixed. That goes back to, the fact that the racial categories are arbitrary, or they're not arbitrary, actually. They were intentionally put in place to benefit the elite, privileged few white male slaveholders, right, at the time. Okay, and so the affirmation is that you have the ability to self-define who you are, right? Too often, Black people, marginalized people, Hispanic people, Indigenous people have been labeled and defined by white society, by white culture, and we see more and more a move for us to define ourselves, self-definition. We see more and more Black and brown people from around the globe wanting to say, you know, I know who I am. Let me tell you who I am, instead of listening to who you say I am, right? And so your affirmation is that I have the power to self-define. All right, y'all, this was a long one, and I knew it would be. It's nitty gritty when it comes to understanding racism versus colorism. But if there are additional questions, we can come back and take a shot at some more questions, because there were a lot of comments and questions that came up towards the end, right, about the UK versus the US, right, and identifying as biracial versus Black. So we can definitely do a part 2 of this if you all are interested, and we can maybe just make the part 2 straight up Q&A and just like a dialogue where it's just all your questions and comments. But for now, I'm going to let you all go. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. I will be back on next week. I don't know what the topic is, but I have it listed on my Facebook and Instagram pages. Thank you all for tuning in and for your engagement, your wonderful insights, testimonies, questions, experiences. And I can't wait to do it again. All right, bye. Take care.